November 17, 1869. The Egyptian desert is hosting the most expensive party on earth. Cannons fire from both banks until the smoke hangs thick in the morning air. Flags from a dozen nations lift in the Mediterranean wind. Royal yachts line up in ceremonial order. On board, princes, diplomats, financiers, journalists, and the Empress of France herself, Eugenie, draped in silk, watching from the deck as the first ships prepare to enter a ribbon of water that did not exist 10 years ago. Egypt's ruler, Ismail Pasha, has spent a fortune to make this moment perfect. New palaces built for guests who will sleep in them once. New roads paved for carriages that will never return. Orchestras, feasts, fireworks, gifts. He wants the world to see Egypt as a modern power. He wants the applause of Europe. And Europe is applauding. Newspapers call it the greatest engineering triumph of the century, a canal linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, a shortcut that eliminates the months-long voyage around Africa. East and West joined through Egypt. It is, by any measure, a spectacular achievement. But look closer at the ceremony and notice who is missing. Where are the men who actually dug this canal? The Egyptian peasants who were pulled from their villages by force, handed picks and baskets, and marched into the desert to cut 164 kilometers of earth with their bare hands. Where are the families of the workers who never came home? Where are the villages that were emptied so that Europe could have its shortcut? They are not on the yachts. They are not in the photographs. They are not in the speeches. As far as this ceremony is concerned, they do not exist. This is the story of the Suez Canal. Not the version with the flags and the fireworks. The real version. The one that starts in the dirt. The idea of connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea through Egypt is thousands of years old. Earlier canals linked parts of the Nile system to the Red Sea at different moments in antiquity. Their exact routes and dates are debated, but the principle was always the same. Egypt sits at the crossroads of the world. Whoever controls the passage controls the trade. For centuries after the ancient canals silted up and disappeared, the desert kept its grip. Ships sailing from Europe to Asia had to go all the way around Africa, down the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and back up into the Indian Ocean. Months at sea. Fortunes spent on every voyage. Entire empires organized around that long, dangerous route. Then, in 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. His expedition was not just military, it was scientific. French surveyors spread across the country, mapping, measuring, digging up ruins, and they found traces of the old canals. Napoleon understood instantly what a modern canal through Egypt would mean. Whoever built it could choke Britain's route to India and control the richest trade corridor on Earth. But his engineers made a critical error. They concluded that the Red Sea was nearly 10 meters higher than the Mediterranean. If true, a simple sea-level canal would be impossible. The calculation was wrong. The two seas are virtually level. But wrong numbers have a strange power. This one killed the idea for 50 years. The dream went to sleep, but the hunger did not. European empires were growing. Steam power was shrinking the world. The race for faster trade routes was accelerating. And Egypt, sitting on the most valuable piece of geography on the planet, was about to become the target. Ferdinand de Lesseps was not an engineer. He had never built anything in his life. He was a French diplomat, a man of charm, connections, and relentless ambition. As a young official stationed in Egypt, He had befriended a boy named Said, the son of Egypt's ruling family. It was a personal connection, a friendship, and de Lesseps would eventually use that friendship to reshape the entire Middle East. In 1854, Said Pasha became the ruler of Egypt. De Lesseps arrived almost immediately, carrying the old idea of a canal and a carefully prepared pitch. He did not come with engineering drawings. He came with flattery, vision, and the promise that Egypt would stand alongside the great powers of the world. On November 30th, 1854, Said signed the first concession. A second followed in January 1856. The terms were extraordinary, and not in Egypt's favor. A private company, headquartered in Paris, would dig the canal and operate it for 99 years. Egypt would provide the land. Egypt would provide the labor. Egypt would pay for a large share of the construction. In return, Egypt was promised a cut of the profits. Read that again. The canal would be dug on Egyptian soil, by Egyptian hands, largely with Egyptian money. But the company that owned it would sit in Paris, and the profits would flow to European shareholders. The Suez Canal Company was formally organized in 1858. De Lesseps tried to sell shares internationally, but Britain refused to participate. Not because Britain cared about Egypt, because Britain did not want France to control a shortcut to India. Britain would fight this canal for years, using every diplomatic tool it had. But remember that, because by the end of this story, Britain will not just accept the canal, it will seize control of it, and then it will occupy Egypt itself to make sure no one ever takes it back. Construction began on April 25, 1859, and from the very first day, the canal was not built by machines. It was built by Egyptians. The system was called corvee. It was forced labor. Egyptian peasants, fellahin, were drafted from their villages across the Nile Delta and Upper Egypt. They did not volunteer, they were ordered. Government officials arrived in villages, counted men, and marched them to the canal zone. Some walked for days to reach the site. They left behind families, farms, and harvests. What waited for them was not a construction site. It was a furnace. The Isthmus of Suez in summer reaches temperatures that can kill. There was almost no shade. There was almost no water. The men dug with picks, shovels, and bare hands. They carried the earth away in baskets on their backs and heads, thousands of them forming human chains stretching across the sand. Hour after hour, day after day. They were not paid, or paid almost nothing. Food was scarce and often spoiled. Fresh water had to be carried in from miles away. Disease swept through the camps. Dysentery, heat stroke, cholera. Men collapsed and were dragged to the edges of the trench. The exact death toll is still debated because nobody was counting. These were peasants, not soldiers. Their names were not recorded. Their deaths were not reported to anyone who cared to write them down. At peak construction, an estimated 20,000 Egyptian workers were laboring in the canal zone at any given time, with new drafts constantly replacing the men who had collapsed, fallen sick, or died. Over the full course of construction, the total number of Egyptians who were forced to work on this canal is estimated in the hundreds of thousands. This was not a footnote. This was the canal. Every meter of it was carved from Egyptian earth by Egyptian hands under a system of forced labor imposed so that a French company could profit and European ships could save time. But before the main canal could move an inch, something else had to be built first. A canal before the canal. The workers needed water to survive, and there was none. So the freshwater canal, called the Sweetwater Canal, was dug to carry Nile water through the desert to the work camps. Egyptian labor built that too. A canal to keep the workers alive long enough to build the real canal. Think about that for a moment. The world would remember the blue line between two seas, but the line that kept the workers alive long enough to finish it was never celebrated, never photographed, and never mentioned in the speeches at the opening ceremony. In the 1860s, Britain discovered something useful: outrage. British diplomats and newspapers launched a campaign against the corvée, condemning the forced labor on the canal as a moral abomination. They demanded it stop. And here is where the story becomes truly bitter. The criticism was not wrong. The forced labor was an abomination. Egyptian workers were being treated as disposable. But Britain did not raise its voice because it cared about Egyptian peasants. Britain raised its voice because it wanted the canal to fail. Every month of delay, every diplomatic crisis, every international scandal around the labor conditions was a tool to slow down a project that threatened British control of trade routes. This is the same Britain that at that very moment was running its own empire on the backs of forced and exploited labor across India, Africa, and the Caribbean. The same Britain that had only abolished slavery in its colonies 30 years earlier and was still profiting from systems built on that slavery. The humanitarianism was real in its words and hollow in its motives. Under international pressure and a formal arbitration process, forced corvée labor was officially curtailed and then ended by the mid-1860s. The project shifted to steam-powered dredgers and European contract workers. Machines replaced men. Iron jaws replaced human hands. And something else happened with that shift. The machines could be photographed. A steam dredger could be named, celebrated, printed in newspapers as proof of progress. But the Egyptian workers, who had already dug years' worth of the canal with their bodies, left almost no trace. No photographs, no memorials, no names. History remembers the machines that arrived at the end far better than the men who made the beginning possible. The canal was still years from completion. Cholera struck the workforce in the 1860s. Sand collapsed, equipment failed, costs spiraled. But de Lesseps held on. French prestige was now tied to this trench in the Egyptian desert, and Egypt, bound by the concession, could not walk away. On August 18, 1869, after a decade of suffering and spectacle, the waters of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea finally met inside Egypt. The canal was complete. It had been built on Egyptian land by Egyptian labor at enormous Egyptian cost. And now the world was coming to celebrate it as a European achievement. And so we return to that morning, November 17, 1869. The fireworks, the yachts, the Empress of France, the applause of a continent. But now you know what is underneath. You know about the villages emptied of their men, the workers who dug in temperatures that could kill, with no water, no pay, and no choice. The cholera, the unmarked graves, the Sweetwater Canal that had to be built just to keep the laborers alive. You know that the concession gave a French company 99 years of profit from Egyptian land. And you know that Egypt paid for much of the construction itself. Ismail Pasha had spent heavily to make this ceremony unforgettable. And it was. New palaces, new opera houses, receptions that lasted days. He wanted Europe to see Egypt as an equal. But Europe was not looking at an equal. Europe was looking at a customer. Every franc Ismail spent on ceremony was borrowed from European banks at crushing interest rates. The glory of the opening was purchased on credit, and the bill was already on its way. For Europe, the canal was a compression of the planet. The voyage from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean no longer required months around Africa. Distance between London and Bombay collapsed. Mail, soldiers, cotton, spices, imperial orders, everything moved faster. Trade routes that had been fixed for centuries pivoted overnight around one narrow Egyptian passage. A line of water dug by Egyptian hands had just redrawn the entire map of global trade. And the men who dug it were not invited to the party. Ismail's dream of a modern Egypt was built on borrowed money. Railways, telegraphs, bridges, schools, palaces, an army, and now the most expensive opening ceremony in history. European banks were happy to lend. The interest rates were not generous, and the repayment schedules were designed for one outcome: default. By 1875, Egypt was drowning in debt. Ismail needed cash immediately, and the only asset valuable enough to save him was Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal Company, the very company that operated on Egyptian soil, built by Egyptian labor. And this is the moment that should make your blood boil. Britain bought the shares. The same Britain that had opposed the canal. The same Britain that had tried to sabotage it. The same Britain that had used Egyptian workers' suffering as a diplomatic weapon. Under Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, the British government arranged emergency financing through the Rothschild banking house and purchased Egypt's shares before most of the world even knew it was happening. No ships changed direction that day. No ceremony marked the occasion. But what happened was far more significant than any opening party. The canal that Egypt had bled for was now, in strategic terms, a British asset. The country that had fought hardest against the canal now controlled it. And they had gotten it not through war, but through debt. They waited for Egypt to go broke, under the weight of loans that European banks had eagerly provided. And then they bought the prize at a discount. This was not commerce. This was a trap. Lend the money, encourage the spending, wait for the collapse, buy the asset. It is a pattern that would repeat across the colonized world for the next century. But Britain was not finished. Owning shares in a canal company was one thing. What Britain really wanted was Egypt itself. In 1879, European powers pressured the Ottoman Sultan to remove Ismail Pasha from power. The man who had built modern Egypt, who had hosted the world at the canal opening, was deposed and exiled. His son Tufik was installed as a more cooperative ruler. But the Egyptian people had watched everything. They had watched their labor build a canal they did not own. They had watched their ruler sell the shares. They had watched foreign powers remove their leader. And in 1881, an Egyptian military officer named Ahmed Urabi led a movement that said simply, "Enough. Egypt for the Egyptians." Britain's response was not diplomatic. In 1882, the Royal Navy bombarded Alexandria. British troops landed and defeated Urabi's forces at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir. Britain occupied Egypt. And the justification? The protection of the Suez Canal and European interests. Read that sentence again. Egyptian workers had dug the canal by force. A French company had taken the profits. Egypt's own shares had been sold to pay debts owed to European banks. And now Britain was occupying the entire country to protect a canal that Egypt had built on its own land with its own hands. The occupation was supposed to be temporary. It lasted 72 years. In 1888, the Convention of Constantinople declared the canal open to all nations in war and peace, a neutral passage, an international waterway. But neutrality is a word that means nothing when one empire has soldiers on both banks. Through 2 world wars, Britain treated the canal as its own military highway. Egyptian sovereignty over the canal existed on paper and nowhere else. A canal built by Egyptian forced labor on Egyptian land had become the reason Egypt lost its freedom. For decades, the canal remained the symbol of everything that had been taken: Egyptian land, Egyptian labor, Egyptian money, Egyptian sovereignty. All of it funneled through a waterway that someone else controlled. Then, on July 26, 1956, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, stood before a crowd in Alexandria and spoke a sentence that echoed across the entire Arab world. He announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. Egypt was taking back the canal. After nearly 100 years, the waterway that had been dug by Egyptian hands on Egyptian soil would finally belong to Egypt. The reaction was immediate and violent. Britain, France, and Israel launched a coordinated military attack on Egypt. They bombed Egyptian airfields. Israeli forces pushed into the Sinai. British and French paratroopers landed near Port Said. The old colonial powers were not going to let their shortcut go without a fight. But 1956 was not 1882. The world had changed. The United States and the Soviet Union, Cold War rivals who agreed on almost nothing, both condemned the attack. International pressure forced Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw. It was the moment the old European empires realized, publicly and humiliatingly, that the age of gunboat diplomacy was over. Egypt kept the canal. Nasser became a symbol of anti-colonial resistance across the developing world. And the Suez Canal, for the first time since its construction, was operated by the country that had built it. Today, roughly 12% of all global trade passes through the Suez Canal. Container ships the size of city blocks move through the same narrow cut that was once dug by hand. In 2021, when a single ship called the Ever Given ran aground and blocked the canal for 6 days, the global economy lost an estimated $10 billion a day. 6 days, one ship, one canal, and the world economy froze. In 2015, Egypt completed a major expansion of the canal, a new parallel channel that allows two-way traffic along parts of the route. It was dug in 1 year, this time by machines, by choice, and by an Egypt that owned every meter of it. But the history does not wash away. The Suez Canal is one of the great engineering achievements in human history. That is true. It changed global trade forever. That is also true. But it was built on forced labor. It was financed through a concession designed to drain Egyptian wealth. Its profits went to European shareholders, and when Egypt could no longer pay the debts that European banks had been happy to provide, the canal became the excuse for occupation. Ferdinand de Lesseps saw a shortcut. Britain saw an asset worth occupying a country for. Ismail saw a stage for Egypt's greatness. The Suez Canal Company saw profit. Nasser saw unfinished business. And the workers? The Egyptian fellahin who dug 164 kilometers of desert with picks and baskets and bare hands? They saw nothing, because nobody asked them to look up. The next time you see a container ship passing through the Suez Canal, remember this. The water is calm now. The ships are enormous. The passage is routine. But underneath the surface, underneath the engineering, Underneath the trade statistics and the shipping schedules, there is sand. And the sand remembers.